I want to tell you exactly what happened in Prophet Hills, because the official record is a lie, and the people who wrote it are either dead or paid enough to stay quiet. I'm not interested in their version anymore. I'm only interested in the truth, and the truth starts 5 years before any of it made sense. On a Tuesday night in April, when I was sitting on the back porch of a house I don't own anymore, listening to my kids argue about whose turn it was to feed the dog. My name is Danny Kessler. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a scientist. I worked 22 years for a regional water management authority, which means I know pipe systems, I know soil composition, I know what the ground sounds like when something is moving through it at depth. That last part matters. You'll understand why. My wife Claire was inside doing dishes, to hear the water running. Hear her humming, something off-key, the way she did when she thought no one was listening. My son Marcus was 11, my daughter Asha was 8. The dog was a shepherd mix, named Fuel, which Marcus had named because he'd gone through a phase of naming everything after things he thought sounded powerful. Fuel, thunder, wrench. He'd grown out of it by that April, but the dog stayed Fuel. The first sound was underground, not a rumble. More like a slow lateral pressure, the kind you feel in the soles of your feet before you hear it in your ears. I'd heard it before, 3 times over the previous 2 months. Always at night, always when the temperature dropped. I'd filed 2 reports with the county. The reports went nowhere. Then Fuel went rigid on the grass and didn't make a sound. That's the thing nobody who wasn't there can quite absorb. The dog didn't bark. Fuel was not a quiet animal. He was loud and stupid and affectionate, and he barked at leaves, at shadows, at the particular way wind moved through the fence slats. He did not bark that night. He pressed himself flat against the deck boards and made no sound at all. And that was the moment I understood we were in genuine trouble before I saw a single thing. I got inside fast. I told Claire to take the kids to the bathroom. Interior room, no windows, and I locked the back door and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. And I want to be clear about this. I grabbed a flashlight, not a weapon. I hadn't thought weapon yet. I'd thought animal. I'd thought coyote. Feral dog pack, something wrong but explicable. I hadn't thought what was actually out there. They came up through the crawl space. I don't know how to describe the first one I saw with language that won't sound like a bad horror story. It was approximately the size of a large dog but built low and horizontal, the way a crocodile is built, though the comparison is imprecise. The skin was a dark, matte gray-green, scaled in a pattern that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Face, and it had a face, not just a snout, was broad and flat, with eyes that sat high and wide, oriented forward like a predator's eyes, pale and luminescent in the dark. It moved quickly. Not the lumbering thing you'd expect from something its size. It moved the way water moves through a tight pipe, all controlled pressure and no wasted motion. There were 3 of them. Claire never made it to the bathroom. I heard her scream once, not a long scream, just one sharp intake and then silence. And by the time I got to the hallway, the back door was off its frame, and there was blood on the kitchen tile, and the only thing standing between me and the things dragging my children toward a hole in the crawlspace floor was 12 feet of linoleum and the flashlight in my hand. I ran at them. I want to be honest about what happened. I got hit once, hard, by something that moved faster than I could track, and I went down. I didn't black out. I lay on the floor with a broken collarbone and a gash along my jaw that would need 14 stitches. And I watched the 3rd one disappear through the hole, with Asha's voice still in the air. And then there was nothing but the sound of the refrigerator humming and Fuel finally making noise outside. This low, sustained whine that went on and on. Called 911 from the floor. I gave them every detail I could. I was coherent. I have the transcript. The police report listed it as a home invasion. Person or persons unknown. Claire's death was classified as a homicide with no suspect identified. My children were listed as missing persons. The crawl space showed evidence of tunneling that the County Geological Survey described as inconsistent with natural subsidence and burrowing mammal activity. I made the mistake of correcting that assessment in public, loudly, repeatedly, in front of reporters and town officials, and anyone who would hold still long enough to listen. I had photographs. I had measurements of the tunnel dimensions. I had Fuel's veterinary records from the following week. which documented injuries consistent with something that had grabbed him by the hindquarters and let go. Not bite marks, but what the vet described as compression marks from digits wider than any native fauna should produce. Mayor Renner had a land deal in progress, $80 million of residential development on the eastern slope of Prophet Hills, contingent on the site being classified as stable, safe, and marketable. I was a man standing in front of a camera saying there were subterranean predators under the town. You can do the math on how long his patience lasted. They didn't arrest me. Hoofed. That would have created more publicity than they wanted. Instead, they used the sheriff, a man named Tom Reeser, to make my life administratively difficult. Permits revoked. A restraining order from my own sister-in-law, Kelly, who believed what she was told, and not what I was showing her. A psych evaluation I was coerced into taking, which concluded I was experiencing prolonged grief-related ideation. I was run out of Prophet Hills inside of 4 months, in the technical sense that I left before they could make me leave, which I now understand was a mistake. I spent 5 years doing what I should have done from the beginning, preparing. Not preparing to grieve, preparing to accept, preparing to go back down. I want to be clear about what that meant, because people have since asked whether I was suicidal, whether the plan was a kind of slow self-destruction, dressed up as rescue. The honest answers is that I genuinely did not care which way I came out. So long as I came out having done the thing, that's not the same thing as suicidal. Suicidal is about wanting to stop. What I felt was the opposite of stopping. It was the most directed I had ever been in my life. I researched subsurface predator behavior across every xenobiological database I could access, which in those early years meant mostly secondhand accounts, and suppressed government filings that people leaked to fringe publications. I'm not proud of the sources, but the information was real. There had been other Prophet Hills. There had been other Kesslers. The creatures, I'll call them what the field literature called them, subterra-class organisms, or just subterra, were not recent. The geological evidence suggested they had been under the inhabited surface of this continent for longer than the continent had been inhabited by humans, which is a sentence that takes time to absorb. They were not invasive. We were. They moved in networked tunnel systems at depths between 12 and 60 feet, depending on season and ground temperature. They were pack hunters, with a demonstrated preference for biological material they could transport, which explained why they took children and not adults when they had the option, and which explained why Claire was killed rather than taken, because she had been between them and the children, and something in their calculus had determined she was an obstacle rather than a resource. That last part I held on to for a long time before I could put it down. I still pick it back up sometimes. In the dark, when there's nothing else to do, their senses were primarily seismic and olfactory. Low light was irrelevant to them. They navigated by vibration and scent. They had documented a sensitivity to specific acoustic frequencies in the 18 to 22 kilohertz range, not painful, but disruptive to the lateral line sensory organs that ran along their flanks. I sourced a modified ultrasonic emitter from a man in Tucson who built them for military contract work, and who asked no questions when I paid cash. The device was about the size of a large thermos, and produced a directional cone of sound that, in field tests, caused the creatures to alter their tunneling path. It wouldn't stop them. It would redirect them for a window of maybe 40 seconds. I learned to read soil. I already knew soil. 22 years of water management had given me that, but I spent 3 more years learning the specific signatures of subterra excavation. The compaction patterns, the ventilation shafts they bored at irregular intervals, which a Tron could spot from the surface as slight depressions in the ground. Maybe 4 inches across, sometimes mistaken for rodent activity. Temperature differential they created in the soil above their tunnels, which an infrared sensor could map if you knew what you were looking at. I mapped Prophet Hills from the outside for 18 months before I came back in. I drove into town on a Wednesday afternoon in October. 5 years. And 6 months after the night I'd left with a broken collarbone and nothing else. The town looked the same. The eastern development was half-built. Skeletal frames on freshly graded lots, cranes idle in the afternoon light, which told me something had stalled the project but hadn't killed it. Mayor Renner's campaign banners were still on the light poles. Sheriff Reeser's patrol car was parked outside the diner on Main Street. I didn't go to the diner. I went to Kelly's house because Kelly was the one person in Prophet Hills who still owed me a conversation. She was Claire's sister, and she had chosen the town's version of events over mine, and I understood why she had done it. She had 2 kids of her own. She had a mortgage. She had to keep living here. But I needed her to look at what I'd brought before I did anything else. She didn't invite me in. We stood on the porch and she looked at me. The way people look at someone who has been right about something they desperately needed to be wrong about. I opened the case and showed her the sensor maps. The tunnel system under Prophet Hills had expanded significantly since I'd last been able to survey it. The original tunnels I'd documented ran primarily under the residential east side, which matched the historical disappearance pattern the town had been explaining away for 2 generations. Missing hikers, missing children. One missing surveyor whose equipment was found but whose body never was. The new mapping showed extension toward the development site. Not random extension, systematic extension, following the groundwork activity. The blasting and grading and heavy machinery that had disturbed the soil above the existing network. We'd woken something up. Or we'd pushed something into a pattern it didn't want to be in, and it was pushing back. How many tunnels, Kelly said. Under the eastern slope alone, at least 40 primary channels that I can trace. The hub points. The wider chambers where the channels intersect. There are 9 of them. Maybe more that I can't detect from the surface. She was quiet for a moment. Kids play on that slope. I know. Reeser will run you out again. I know that too. Then what are you here for, Danny? Do you actually need? I need someone who lives here to know what I know, so that if I go in and don't come back out, the information doesn't die with me. She looked at me for a long time. Then she stepped back and held the door open. I want to say a word about Mayor Renner, because people have since characterized him as a villain, and while I understand the impulse, the reality is more ordinary, and therefore more depressing. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, and he had organized his fear into a set of financial and political priorities that had solidified over 20 years into something he could no longer distinguish from principle. He believed the development deal was good for the town. He believed, or had chosen to believe, that the disappearances had other explanations. He had told himself the story so many times that he couldn't hear the cracks in it anymore. But he was not stupid. He knew I was back within an hour of my arrival. Reeser came to Kesey House that evening, which I expected. What I hadn't expected was that he came alone and didn't lead with a threat. He looked in Kelly's kitchen and looked at the sensor maps spread across her table and didn't say anything for almost 2 minutes. These are real, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes. The development crew hit something 3 weeks ago, blasting on the North Ridge. 2 workers went missing that night. Frères had it classified as an equipment accident. He rubbed the back of his neck. I signed the report. I know you did. I didn't think. He stopped. I thought you were wrong. Genuinely thought you were wrong. I know that too. He wasn't going to help me officially. He couldn't. Not without dismantling 5 years of decisions that implicated him. He also wasn't going to run me out of town. What he could offer was 48 hours of looking the other way. And he offered it with the expression of a man paying a debt he'd been pretending he didn't owe. The creatures came to the surface on the 3rd night, not in force. Not yet. But a group of them emerged on the north slope near the development site, where the blasting had apparently breached or damaged a primary tunnel hub. Were 6 confirmed sightings. One of the construction crew's security guards was taken. His partner fired a weapon, and the sound apparently disrupted them enough that they retreated. People saw them clearly enough to give descriptions that matched my documentation precisely. By the next morning, Renner's office was getting calls from the construction company's parent firm, because their site was now unsecured, and 2 workers were missing. And the security footage, which Renner had not known about, which was the crack that broke the story open, showed things that no one in his office could classify as a geological event. The deal started collapsing at noon. I wasn't watching it collapse. By noon, I was already underground. I want to describe this carefully because it matters. The entry point I'd identified was a ventilation shaft on the old Kessler property. My old property, the house I hadn't owned for 4 years, that I had marked 18 months ago from the surface and verified 3 times via probe sensors before I touched it with my hands. The shaft was 9 inches in diameter, bored at an angle of approximately 30 degrees from vertical, leading to a primary channel at a depth of about 22 feet. I'd spent 4 months building a descent rig that could get me down and back up in a shaft that size, a motorized friction clamp system, with a hand crank backup attached to a carbon fiber anchor plate that I could seat in the shaft rim without requiring any surface personnel to hold it. I went alone. I want to address the obvious objection. You should have had backup. You should have told someone exactly where you were going. And the answer is that I had left complete documentation with Kelly, and that I had gone alone, because the subterra track human body heat and vibration, and 2 people produce more than twice the seismic signature of 1. And I had spent 5 years figuring out how to be the quietest possible version of a human being moving through their environment. The descent took 11 minutes. The shaft was tight and smelled of wet mineral clay and something organic underneath it. A musk that the literature described as a territorial marker, slightly ammonia forward, not overwhelming but persistent. At 22 feet the shaft opened laterally into a primary channel, and I came out of the descent rig onto the channel floor in a crouch and stayed still for 90 seconds. Nothing came. The channel was about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, with a floor that had been compacted smooth by repeated passage. Not excavated the way a human engineer would excavate. No right angles, no uniform bore diameter, but deliberately shaped, smoothed by something that understood the value of removing friction from a transit route. The walls had striations from the excavation process, and in the beam of my headlamp, they showed layers of geological time, like a record of everything that had happened in the soil above. The old glacial till, a seam of clay, a band of darker organic material from some long ego surface, and then the worked stone of the channel wall, smoother and harder than anything around it, as if they'd somehow densified the material as they moved through it. The network was real. It had always been real. I'd known it was real for 5 years, but standing inside it with the smell and the silence and the absolute darkness beyond my headlamp's reach was different from knowing it abstractly, in the way that seeing the sea for the first time is different from understanding that oceans exist. I moved east. The mapping suggested the primary hub that serviced the residential tunnels. The hub closest to where my house had stood was approximately 300 meters in that direction. I moved at a pace I'd practiced until it was automatic. Slow enough that my footfalls were below the threshold the literature documented as subterra detectable vibration, which required a deliberate heel-to-toe placement on each step, weight transfer gradual and complete before the next step. It was exhausting in the way that a sustained isometric hold is exhausting, not cardio, but a continuous muscular tension that accumulated. I heard them before I reached the hub, or rather I felt them. That low lateral pressure in the soles of my feet, the same sensation I'd had on the porch 5 years ago, which my body now recognized and cataloged before my conscious mind had caught up. I stopped. I activated the ultrasonic emitter to its lowest setting, which the literature described as a passive dispersal mode. Not a directed pulse, just a low-level diffusion that would make the local tunnel environment mildly aversive without triggering a response. Pressure in the floor diminished. They had changed direction. I kept moving. The hub was larger than I'd modeled from the surface surveys, approximately 15 meters in diameter, roughly oval, with ceiling height that rose to nearly 8 feet at the apex. 12 tunnel mouths opened from the perimeter. Floor was different here. Not packed clay, but something more like deliberate construction, flat stones set close together, the gaps filled with compressed mineral matter. The walls bore marks that I want to describe with precision. They were not random abrasion. They were repeated, overlapping, arranged in patterns that radiated from a central point. I don't know what they meant. I know what they looked like, which was intentional. Whatever these things were, they had been in these tunnels long enough to build in them. I found the first chamber off the 3rd tunnel from the eastern arc. It was sealed, Not with a door, but with a dense fibrous mass packed into the tunnel mouth, slightly warm to the touch, with a texture that reminded me of a wasp nest, papery and structural. I used a folding utility knife to make an opening large enough to see through, and I put my headlamp up to the gap and looked. I won't tell you everything I saw. I'll tell you what I need to tell you, which is that my children were alive and there were others. 11 people in that chamber, 7 of them children. None of them restrained in any physical sense. None of them visibly injured in ways that suggested ongoing harm. The chamber was warm, approximately body temperature warm, which explained why the surface infrared mapping had shown thermal anomalies in that sector. There was food material in the chamber. I could not identify its composition in the moment, and there was water seepage from a crack in the far wall that they'd been drinking from. I had not allowed myself to consider this specific possibility, that they would be alive. I had prepared for the other outcome. I had prepared for finding evidence, traces, things I would have to carry back to the surface and do something with. I had not prepared for Asha's face turning toward the gap in the chamber wall, and her saying, "Dad," in the voice of a 12-year-old who had been 8 when I last heard her speak. I want to be honest with you. I lost 30 seconds. I don't know what I did in those 30 seconds. I think I put my hand through the gap and held her hand. And I think I said something, but I can't tell you what. Then I got my head back and told her quietly that we were going to move. And I asked her how many there were who could walk without help. "All of us," she said. "Except Mr. Vance, he hurt his ankle." I asked about Marcus. "He's here. He's okay. He's been in charge." Marcus was 16. He had been managing 11 people in a subterranean alien holding chamber. And he had been doing it well enough that when I got the fibrous seal cleared and put my headlamp through to illuminate the full space, I could see the organization of it. The people arranged by need, the children in the warmest part of the chamber, Mr. Vance elevated on a makeshift pallet of clothing, Marcus at the tunnel end with what appeared to be a sharpened piece of wall stone in his hand. He had been ready for whatever came through the wall. He lowered the stone when he saw my face and didn't say anything. Neither did I. The egress took 1 hour and 47 minutes. I will compress it here because the details are operational, and what matters is the shape. We moved in a line, slowly, with the ultrasonic emitter running continuous passive dispersal. Twice the creatures approached from side tunnels, and twice the emitter redirected them. Mr. Vance. He was a construction surveyor, as it happened, which under other circumstances I would have found grimly appropriate, was helped between Marcus and a woman named Kara, who turned out to be one of the missing development workers. She had been down there for 3 weeks. We came up through the same shaft one at a time. The ascent rig could only take 200 pounds and took 4 minutes per ascent. I sent the children first, with Asha operating the hand crank from the top. She'd watched me work it twice and understood the mechanism immediately, which told me something about who she'd become in 5 years. And then the adults in order of mobility, and I came up last. It was late afternoon when I came out. The sky was the specific orange-gray of a late autumn day when the sun is already behind the ridge. Reeser was standing in the yard. He'd figured out where I was going and come. And to his credit, he had brought 2 deputies and an ambulance, and he didn't say anything when I came up. And he just looked at the 11 people standing in the yard. "How many more down there?" he said. "I don't know. The hub I found surfaces at least 4 residential tunnel clusters. Only cleared 1 chamber. There may be others." He nodded slowly. "You're going back down. As soon as they're triaged. I'll go with you." I looked at him. He was 53 and had a bad knee from an old motorcycle accident and had spent 5 years avoiding this exact conversation with himself. "You'll have to move slowly," I said. "I know how to be slow when I need to be." We went back down that evening. We cleared 2 more chambers, 7 more people, 4 of them children, 2 of them names on a missing persons list that was 8 years old. The creatures moved in force twice during the second excursion. The emitter held them both times, though on the second occurrence I had to boost to directed pulse mode, which produced a physical reaction in the nearest one I'd never documented from the surface. A lateral convulsion that moved through the flanks like a current, followed by rapid retreat. They did not return during the time it took us to get everyone up. Renner called the federal authorities that night. she. Not because he'd grown a conscience, though I believe something shifted in him when he saw the people coming out of the ground, but because the construction company's lawyers had made it clear that the project liability, now that the footage was public, required federal containment classification. And Renner understood that he had about 12 hours to be the man who called it in rather than the man who was called in about. The federal response was what you'd expect. Serious, coordinated, and entirely unprepared for the scale of what they found. The network under Prophet Hills extended over 43 square miles. The survey that was eventually completed, and which has never been fully released publicly, mapped 912 hub chambers and approximately 18,000 linear meters of primary channel. The population estimate for the organisms inhabiting the network at the time of the survey was between 800 and 1,200 individuals. They had been here before us. They were going to be here after us. The federal response eventually concluded that the Eastern development would not proceed, and that Prophet Hills would require a managed coexistence protocol, and that the specifics of that protocol remain classified, which is a way of saying that someone in a government building is still deciding how to explain to the public that the ground under their feet has always had tenants. I have opinions about that decision. I'll keep them to myself. Marcus and Asha came home with me. That's not a complicated sentence, but it took 5 years and everything I had to make it true. Marcus was 16 and tall and quiet in the way that people are quiet when they've had to be quiet for a long time. And he worked through what had happened at his own pace, which was slower than what the counselors wanted and faster than I feared. Asha was 12 and already, in some fundamental way, more certain of herself than I had been at twice her age. She told me once, without any particular drama, that she had decided in the first month underground that they were going to be found, and that deciding it had made it easier to act like it was true, and that acting like it was true had made it true. I didn't know what to say to that. I told her I thought that was right. The dog, Fuel, had lived with Kelly for the 5 years I was gone. When I brought him back to the new house, he was old and gray-muzzled and moved like something expensive to repair. But he still pressed himself flat and went silent when the wind shifted a certain way in the evenings. Some things a body learns and doesn't unlearn. I understood that now in ways I hadn't before. I'd hear the ground differently for the rest of my life. Feel for that lateral pressure in my feet when I walked across grass at night. Run the old calculations automatically. Note the slight depressions in soil that most people would step over without seeing. It wasn't a burden. It was just the shape of knowing something. Kelly asked me once, after everything was settled, whether I was angry at the years I'd lost. I told her I wasn't. The years weren't lost. They were spent, same as anything else worth spending. You do the accounting, and it comes out what it comes out, and you move forward because moving forward is the only direction available. Preaser resigned from the sheriff's position. He wrote me a letter that I keep, not because it changes anything, but because it's an honest document, and honest documents are rarer than they should be. He said he was sorry he hadn't believed me. He said he wasn't sure it would have changed anything if he had. He said he didn't know what the right answer was to a problem that big. I wrote back that I didn't either. I told him the only answer I'd ever found was to go in anyway, with the best equipment you could build in the time you had, and move slowly and not stop. That's all I have for you. That's the whole of it. The ground under Prophet Hills is quiet now, or as quiet as it gets. The sensors I left in place, yes, I left sensors. The federal team found them, and eventually agreed to integrate them into their monitoring network, which I consider a minor victory. Those sensors show normal transit patterns, normal depth, oscillation with the seasons, normal everything. 2 species, bees, have been sharing this ground for longer than anyone has been keeping records. We always knew, in the oldest part of the brain that still remembers what it was afraid of, before language gave us other things to be afraid of. I think about those marks on the hub wall sometimes. The repeated, overlapping patterns radiating from the center. I think about what they were communicating, and to whom, and over what span of time. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure the answer is mine to have. What I know is this. They took what was mine, and I went and got it back, and we are all still here, and the ground is quiet, And that is enough.